pine forests of northern Wisconsin are not silent places. They creak and groan with every gust of wind, and in the stillness between you hear the faint cracking of branches, the rustle of unseen animals moving in the undergrowth. But on one cold morning in late October 1897, the silence was broken by something far more disturbing. A farmer named Matthew Rourke was clearing brush along the edge of his property near the town of Rhinelander. His plow snagged on something buried beneath layers of moss and damp earth. Thinking it to be nothing more than a rotting stump, he tugged at the roots until a half-buried wooden trunk revealed itself. Its iron hinges were eaten by rust, its boards swollen from years of rain and snow. Rourke, grumbling at the extra work, pried the lid open with the back of his axe. What he saw inside chilled him to the bone. Neatly stacked within the trunk were human skulls, pale, hollow, and arranged as though placed there with purpose. Some bore cracks along the crown, others were pristine, almost polished. Their empty sockets seemed to stare at him accusingly, silently demanding an explanation. Rourke staggered backward, gagging from the smell of damp rot that still clung to the bones. He had lived his entire life among hunters, trappers, and lumbermen. He knew the bones of deer, elk, and bear. These were not the bones of animals. These were human. Word spread quickly. Within hours, men on horseback were riding into town, carrying the news to the sheriff. A crowd gathered in the fading afternoon light, whispering rumors and crossing themselves as they spoke. Some believed the skulls belonged to indigenous graves, disturbed by accident. Others muttered that witches had been practicing rituals in the woods. But as the sheriff and his deputies hauled the trunk into town, setting it in the middle of the street for all to see, the truth began to gnaw at the community. These skulls were not remnants of the distant past. They were recent. The sheriff, a stout man named Charles Winstead, counted 13 skulls in all. Each had been cleaned with unusual care, stripped of flesh, soil, and roots. Someone had not simply buried their dead here. Someone had collected them. The discovery turned the small logging town into a place of dread. People locked their doors at night. Men carried rifles on their way to work in the camps, and mothers refused to let their children wander near the woods. The air grew heavy with suspicion. Who could have done such a thing? And more importantly, why? In the taverns and bunkhouses of Rhinelander, rumors sharpened into fear. Some whispered of a spirit, a ghostly figure seen wandering the tree line carrying a lantern. Others spoke of drifters who had vanished over the years, their names fading like smoke. A few dared to whisper that the killer might be living among them, drinking from the same mugs, working side by side with honest men in the forest. The sheriff promised answers, but privately he admitted he had never seen anything like it. Murder was rare enough in this part of Wisconsin, but murder followed by this. Ritual, it was unthinkable. The skulls became the starting point of a nightmare that would take months to unravel. Behind their hollow stares lay a trail of vanished men, laborers, wanderers, and forgotten souls whose disappearances had been brushed aside as the comings and goings of transient workers. Their stories would soon surface, each more unsettling than the last. And at the center of it all was one man. Not a doctor, not a scholar of anatomy, not even an undertaker. A man who swung an axe for a living. A man who lived and bled in the rough world of the lumber camps. His name was Isaac Draycott. But to the men of Rhinelander, he would forever be remembered by another name. The lumberjack who collected skulls. To understand how Isaac Draycott came to haunt the forests of Wisconsin, we must first step back into the world he lived in. The late 19th century was a time when the frontier still lingered in the northern states, when towns rose and fell on the strength of timber and the sweat of the men who cut it. Wisconsin's logging camps in the 1880s and 1890s were rough, transient places. Picture endless miles of towering pine and spruce, stretching so far the horizon seemed swallowed by trees. The air was thick with the scent of resin and wood smoke, punctuated by the rhythmic thud of axes and the shriek of saws biting into timber. Men worked from before dawn until after dusk, their hands blistered, their backs bent, their wages modest but vital. When the day's labor ended, they poured into crude bunkhouses or drifted toward taverns chasing warmth and cheap whiskey. It was a world of constant movement. Many of these men were drifters, immigrants from Norway, Sweden, and Germany, farm boys looking for cash, runaways who had nowhere else to go. They came and went without records, their names scribbled only briefly in company ledgers. If one vanished, few asked questions. A worker gone today might just as easily turn up in Minnesota or Michigan tomorrow. That anonymity, that silence would prove fertile ground for a man like Isaac Draycott, Isaac was born in 1851, across the river in Minnesota, the son of a modest farming family. Little is recorded of his childhood, but accounts from neighbors remembered him as a quiet boy, prone to wandering alone in the woods for hours. He collected animal bones, arranging them carefully behind the barn. Some children in the community avoided him, unnerved by his fascination with death. Yet to adults he seemed harmless, just another odd farm boy in a rural world where eccentricities were tolerated. By the time Isaac reached his 20s, the family farm could no longer support all its children. Like so many others, he drifted toward the lumber trade. In the logging camps he found steady work. He was strong, capable, and diligent, never one to complain about long hours or bitter winters. His fellow loggers described him as distant but reliable, a man who spoke little and preferred solitude. He drank less than most, never gambled, and kept to himself when others roared with laughter over cards or wrestling matches. But there were small details in hindsight that marked him as different. At night, when most men collapsed into sleep, Isaac often stayed awake, sketching by lantern light. He drew skulls of deer, raccoons, even stray dogs. Some workers recalled seeing him boiling animal heads in kettles near his cabin, stripping them down to bone. He said it was for study, for curiosity, and at the time no one thought much of it. In a world where hunters displayed antlers proudly on their walls, bones were not unusual. Still, there was something in his obsession, the precision with which he handled them, that set him apart. The culture of the time only deepened the shadows around Isaac. Death was a familiar visitor in the 19th century. Disease, accidents, and the brutality of frontier life meant that few families escaped loss. Graves were often shallow, markers simple, and superstition about spirits lingering among the living ran deep. In saloons, men swapped stories of ghosts wandering the forest or demons preying on travelers. Against this backdrop, the quiet, solitary lumberjack with his fascination for bones seemed strange but not yet terrifying. By the mid-1890s, Isaac had become a fixture in the camps near Rhinelander. He was never popular, but he was tolerated. Men joked about his odd hobbies, calling him Doc for his interest in anatomy, though it was said more in jest than respect. If he heard the mockery, he never let on. Instead, he disappeared into the woods during his free hours, always with a small sack, always returning long after the others were asleep. No one at the time could have guessed that these solitary wanderings were not simply the pastimes of a peculiar man. They were the beginnings of something darker. The woods around Rhinelander, vast and silent, offered Isaac both cover and opportunity. In a land where men often vanished without explanation, his obsessions would find room to grow unchecked. For the community, life went on. Loggers rose each morning, axes sang, trains carried endless loads of timber southward. But beneath the rhythm of daily labor, beneath the noise of industry, something sinister was taking shape, and when it surfaced, it would forever scar the town and its people. Isaac Draycott was no longer just the odd man in the bunkhouse. In time, he would become something far more terrifying. A collector not of trophies or treasures, but of human skulls. Disappearances were not uncommon in the lumber towns of northern Wisconsin. Men came and went with the seasons, their names fading quickly from the ledgers of the logging companies. A man who vanished in winter might be assumed to have moved on by spring. A letter home that never arrived could be explained away by poor mail service or the careless loss of a traveling worker. But in the mid-1890s, those disappearances began to take on a darker pattern, one that no one recognized until it was far too late. The first man believed to have fallen victim to Isaac Draycott was a farmhand named Peter Holm. He had left his family's small dairy farm in search of better wages, carrying little more than a bundle of clothes and a worn Bible. Holm worked for a season in the same camp as Isaac. One night, after a quarrel over wages in the tavern, he was last seen following Isaac down a narrow trail toward the river. He never returned. The foreman assumed Holm had simply abandoned his post as so many others did. His family wrote letters that went unanswered. But in the bustling chaos of frontier life, his absence was swallowed in silence. Then there was Henry Lowe, a teenager of just 16 who had run away from home after clashing with his father. He arrived at the Rhinelander camp wide-eyed, eager to prove himself among the seasoned loggers. Henry was known for his laughter, for the way he could turn a dull evening in the bunkhouse into a chorus of stories. But one evening, after a day of heavy drinking, Henry was seen stumbling into the night, Isaac walking behind him with a lantern. When questioned later, Isaac claimed the boy had set off for Duluth. His absence, too, was dismissed. These men, and others like them, slipped through the cracks of society. They were migrants, drifters, runaways, people no one was powerful enough to search for. And Isaac exploited that silence. His method was chilling in its precision. He never struck in the daylight, never in the presence of others. Instead, he waited for nights when the camp was restless with drink, when arguments flared and tempers burned out of control. He would lure his chosen victim away, sometimes with promises of extra wages, sometimes with the simple offer of company on a walk home. In the deep woods, away from the sounds of the camp, Isaac struck swiftly. An axe, a rope, a heavy blow, no one knew for certain. What was known much later was that he always removed the skull. Isaac did not bury his victims whole. The bodies were left shallowly covered in earth or brush, claimed quickly by the elements and by scavenging animals. But the skulls were different. He carried them back to his cabin, or to secluded places in the forest. There by firelight he cleaned them. Some he boiled, the steam carrying a sickly sweet odor that hung in the air. Others he scraped with a knife until the last remnants of flesh were gone. He arranged them carefully as though cataloging specimens for study. But for what purpose? That question lingered then, and it lingers still. Unlike grave robbers or so-called collectors, Isaac never displayed his trophies. He did not sell them, nor did he seek notoriety. He kept them hidden, locked away in trunks or buried beneath moss. It was not pride but obsession that drove him, the need to preserve, to capture something that others let rot away. When asked years later, his only explanation was that the skulls were too beautiful to leave to the worms. The men he killed were not nameless shadows, though time and silence nearly reduced them to that. Each carried hopes, burdens, and unfinished stories. Peter Holm had dreamed of sending money home to save his struggling farm. Henry Lowe had spoken often of finding land of his own one day. Others left behind faint trails, a pocket watch pawned in town, a jacket later found on another man who had bought it cheap. Each life extinguished left behind small haunting reminders of a future that would never come. By the winter of 1896, whispers began to stir in the bunkhouses. Too many men had gone missing. Too many times Isaac had been the last to see them. Some muttered about spirits in the forest, about a ghost lantern seen bobbing through the trees on nights when the wind howled. Others began to suspect something human, something far worse than a phantom. But fear kept them silent. No one dared confront Isaac directly, and so the disappearances continued, the woods swallowing man after man until the day the farmer's plow broke open the trunk in the earth and spilled its ghastly contents into the light. Only then did the town realize the scope of what Isaac Draycott had done. He had not merely killed, he had collected. The discovery of the trunk filled with skulls in October of 1897 was the moment Rhinelander's quiet fears hardened into something undeniable. The sheriff, Charles Winstead, was no stranger to violence. Logging accidents, drunken fights, even the occasional murder born of temper and whiskey. But this was different. This was deliberate. 13 skulls, stripped and arranged as though someone had cherished them. It was a crime that chilled even the most hardened lumbermen. The first task was identification. Could these skulls belong to men known to have gone missing from the camps? Winstead sent word to nearby towns, compiling lists of laborers who had never returned for their wages. Families were contacted, descriptions gathered, but the science of the 1890s was primitive. There were no fingerprints to cross-check, no dental records to compare. All the sheriff could rely on were scars, fractures, or distinguishing marks left on the bone. One skull showed signs of a broken jaw that had healed poorly. Another bore the marks of a childhood injury. Slowly, with painful uncertainty, connections were drawn. At the same time, suspicion turned toward the living. Who among the camps had the strength, the opportunity, and most disturbingly, the desire to do such a thing? Eyes turned almost immediately to Isaac Draycott. He had lived among them for years, quiet, solitary, his strange obsession with bones whispered about in bunkhouses. Men remembered the times he wandered into the forest at night with his lantern, the odd sketches of skulls he left lying near his bunk, the smell of boiling flesh that sometimes drifted from his cabin. Until the trunk was unearthed, these had been peculiarities. Now they were pieces of a far darker puzzle. Sheriff Winstead knew that suspicion alone was not enough. To accuse a man of such monstrous crimes required evidence. And so, Late in the autumn of 1897, he led a small group of deputies to Isaac's cabin on the edge of the camp. The cabin was modest. Rough-hewn logs, a single shuttered window, a door worn smooth by years of use. Isaac answered calmly when they knocked. He did not run. He did not protest. When told they intended to search his home, he simply stepped aside. What they found inside confirmed their worst fears. On a shelf near the bed sat 3 more skulls, polished to a sheen, arranged neatly as though they were ornaments. Beneath the bed was a sack containing bones, femurs, ribs, fragments of spines, all carefully cleaned. In the corner stood a battered trunk filled with notebooks. The deputies opened them to reveal page after page of sketches, not of landscapes or people, but of bones. Human skulls drawn from every angle, labeled with notes in Isaac's precise hand. The journals were a catalogue of his obsession, a macabre collection of studies that left little doubt about the mind behind them. When the sheriff confronted him, Isaac did not rage or plead. He spoke quietly, almost matter-of-factly. They were too beautiful, he said, to leave to the worms. That was his explanation, offered with a kind of solemn sincerity. He denied hatred, denied cruelty. He claimed he had preserved what others wasted. The deputies shackled him then, their hands trembling as they did so. Some later admitted they were more afraid of his calmness than they would have been of fury. A man in rage could be understood, contained. But Isaac's composure, his stillness, hinted at something deeper, something no lawman could truly reckon with. Word of his arrest spread quickly. In Rhinelander, crowds gathered outside the sheriff's office, craning their necks for a glimpse of the man who had haunted their woods. Newspapers seized on the story, dubbing him the skull collector of Wisconsin. Headlines carried the lurid details across the Midwest, each account adding to the horror and fascination. But behind the spectacle lay unanswered questions. How many men had Isaac killed? 13 skulls had been found in the buried trunk, 3 more in his cabin. But could there be others? The woods stretched endlessly in all directions, offering countless places to conceal the dead. Some whispered the true number might be 2, even 3 times as high. Isaac, for his part, gave no answers. He admitted to nothing. He explained nothing further. Beyond his cryptic statement about beauty and worms, he remained silent. The community, however, could not remain silent. Families of missing men arrived in Rhinelander, demanding to know if their loved ones were among the dead. Mothers clutched faded letters. Wives brought worn garments for recognition. The sheriff could offer little comfort. In many cases, he could not say with certainty whose remains had been found. For those families, closure would never come. As winter closed in on 1897, Isaac Draycott sat in a cell awaiting trial. The skulls that had once lain hidden in the earth now sat locked in the sheriff's evidence room, grim witnesses to his crimes. The community, shaken to its core, waited for justice, but beneath their fear lay a deeper unease. That justice could never explain what truly drove a man to such acts. Isaac had been captured, but the mystery of his mind remained locked away, as impenetrable as the frozen woods themselves. The farmer's discovery in October 1897 was only the beginning. Once the sheriff's men lifted the moss-stained trunk from the soil and revealed its contents, Rhinelander was thrust into a storm it had never known before. 13 skulls, each arranged with almost reverent care, stared back at the town from beneath the courthouse lanterns, a grotesque inventory of the missing. Sheriff Charles Winstead, a veteran of frontier law, knew the town could not afford hysteria, but fear already rippled through every cabin and boarding house. People whispered about spirits, witches, and grave robbers. Yet as the sheriff studied the remains more closely, it became clear these were not relics of long-forgotten graves. They were fresh, shockingly so, and belonged to men who had vanished within recent years. Winstead began his work the only way he knew how, by speaking to the men of the logging camps. He asked questions in bunkhouses, taverns, even in the frozen clearings where lumbermen felled trees. At first, answers were scarce. Workers shrugged, claiming drifters often disappeared without trace. But slowly a pattern began to form. Time and again, the name Isaac Draycott surfaced like a dark thread woven through each tale. He was the last man seen with Peter Holm, the farmhand who quarreled in the tavern. He had walked behind young Henry Lowe with his lantern the night the boy vanished. Men recalled his odd habits, wandering into the forest after dark, boiling animal remains, sketching skulls by lamplight. These were once dismissed as eccentricities. Now they took on a far more sinister meaning. Still, suspicion alone was not enough. Sheriff Winstead needed proof, something undeniable that tied Isaac to the skulls. And so, in the waning days of autumn, he gathered a small posse of deputies and rode out to Isaac's cabin, a lonely dwelling tucked deep among the pines. The cabin was unremarkable. Rough-hewn logs, a thin trail of smoke curling from its chimney, the steady chop of firewood echoing in the crisp air. When Isaac opened the door, his expression was calm, almost welcoming, as though expecting their arrival. Winstead explained their purpose. Isaac neither argued nor resisted. He simply stepped aside. What they found inside silenced even the most hardened deputy. On a crude wooden table sat two skulls, cleaned so thoroughly they gleamed in the lantern light. In the corner, stacked neatly as firewood, lay bones, femurs, ribs, fragments of vertebrae, all stripped of flesh. Beneath his cot, they discovered a canvas sack, heavy with smaller remains. And then, in a battered trunk at the foot of his bed, they uncovered what may have been the most disturbing evidence of all: a series of notebooks. Each page was filled with sketches, meticulous drawings of skulls, jawbones, rib cages. Notes scrawled in a steady hand labeled every detail: fracture left side, healed wound along jaw, tooth missing upper right. The journals were not the idle doodles of a bored worker. They were the studies of a man consumed by anatomy, by preservation, by death itself. When Sheriff Winstead confronted him, Isaac did not raise his voice. He did not protest innocence. He looked at the sheriff and said only, "They were too beautiful to leave to the worms." That single sentence, delivered with the calmness of a prayer, was all the explanation he ever gave. The deputies shackled him, their hands trembling. Some later admitted they feared not what he might do, but what he represented. A man who could live among them, work beside them, and commit such acts in silence. A man who looked at death not with horror, but with fascination. By the time Isaac was led into Rhinelander under guard, word had already spread. Crowds gathered along the road, craning to see the lumberjack accused of collecting skulls. Some jeered, some crossed themselves, others stared in stunned silence. The newspapers seized upon the story, christening him the skull collector of Wisconsin. But even with Isaac in chains, the investigation was far from finished. The 13 skulls in the mossy trunk and the bones in his cabin were proof enough of murder, yet questions loomed larger than answers. How many had he truly killed? How many bodies still lay hidden beneath the forest floor, their skulls carried away as trophies? No one could say. Isaac himself would never reveal the full truth. The town wanted justice, families wanted closure, but what they received was something far more unsettling. Silence from the man who had lived among them, worked beside them, and carried his secret into the woods night after night. Isaac Draycott had been captured. Yet the mystery of why he did what he did, why skulls, why such reverence for the remains of the dead, remained as impenetrable as the dark pines that had hidden him for so long. The arrest of Isaac Draycott sent ripples through the northern frontier. Rhinelander, once just another rough logging town, became the center of a chilling spectacle. Reporters arrived by train, their columns spilling lurid details into newspapers as far away as Chicago and St. Louis. Headlines christened him the Skull Collector, the Butcher of Rhinelander, and the Lumberjack of Death. For a brief moment, Isaac was transformed from an anonymous woodsman into a figure of national infamy. Yet behind the sensational ink and curious crowds, the town itself carried the heavier burden. Families traveled from distant counties, clutching faded photographs and handwritten letters, desperate to know whether their missing sons, brothers, or husbands were among the dead. They lined the courthouse steps waiting for word, their faces pale in the frost. Sheriff Winstead did what he could, but science in 1897 could not give them certainty. For many there would be no clear answer, only the hollow ache of absence. Isaac's trial began the following spring. The courthouse, normally a place of quiet disputes over land or contracts, was suddenly overrun. Journalists crowded the benches, their pens scratching feverishly as each detail was revealed. The evidence was overwhelming. 15 skulls, bones discovered in his cabin, journals filled with anatomical sketches. Witnesses described the last times they had seen their loved ones, often in Isaac's company. Former bunkmates testified about his odd habits: boiling animal remains, drawing bones by lantern light, vanishing into the woods for hours. The defense had little to offer. They attempted to paint Isaac as insane, a man not in control of his actions, but Isaac himself never embraced this claim. He sat through the proceedings with the same quiet composure he had shown at his arrest, speaking rarely. When asked why he collected skulls, he gave the same cryptic answer. They were too beautiful to leave to the worms. He offered no elaboration, no apology. His silence unnerved the courtroom more than any outburst ever could. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Isaac Draycott was found guilty of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Wisconsin did not have a death penalty at the time, and so he was spared the gallows. Some in Rhinelander felt justice had been too merciful. Others simply felt relief that he would never again walk free among them. He was transferred to Walpen State Prison, a massive stone fortress that loomed above the surrounding fields. There, among thieves and killers, Isaac remained an enigma. Guards reported he kept to himself, spending long hours sketching bones and reading whatever medical texts he could obtain. He spoke little, ate sparingly, and never once expressed remorse. In 1902, barely 5 years into his sentence, he died quietly in his cell. The cause was recorded as pneumonia. There was no family to claim his body. He was buried in an unmarked grave within the prison grounds, the earth swallowing him as silently as he had once swallowed his victims. For Rhinelander, the wounds lingered. Families without closure continued to wonder whether their missing loved ones had been among Isaac's hidden victims. Some claimed to see ghostly lanterns swaying among the trees, a reminder of the men who vanished there. For years, loggers would not pass certain trails at night, fearing the woods still held secrets yet uncovered. As time passed, Isaac Draycott faded from national headlines. He was overshadowed by later, more infamous killers. But in Rhinelander and the surrounding counties, his story never truly died. Old men in taverns spoke of him in hushed tones, warning younger generations about the dangers lurking in the forest. Parents told children not to wander alone, invoking his name like a shadowy cautionary tale. What remained most disturbing was not simply the number of men Isaac killed, but the mystery of why. He did not act for money, for revenge, or even for notoriety. His crimes did not fit neatly into the motives the world understood. Instead, his obsession was with the bones themselves, with the human skull as an object of strange beauty. That unanswered question haunted those who tried to make sense of his actions. Even today, as the forests of Wisconsin stand tall and silent, some believe more of his victims remain hidden beneath the moss and soil, their skulls never recovered, their names never known. The case of Isaac Draycott leaves us with one final question, one that history may never answer. What compels a man to find beauty only in death, and to preserve it at such a terrible cost?